warm welcome to you all today. I don't know about where you guys are, but we're very hot up here in the Northwest. For those of you that don't know, I'm Emily from Charity Recruit, and I'm really pleased that you can join us this afternoon. Today's session is something which we know is challenging across the sector around how charities can stay financially agile in a landscape full of change and uncertainty. But we're really thrilled that we're going to be joined by Claire today, who's a seasoned finance director with over 15 years experience of leading both regional and national charities through growth, contraction and everything in between, really. She's bringing with her not only a technical expertise, but a deep understanding of the issues that charity leaders do face every day. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Claire, and I hope you find the session relevant and thought-provoking.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to have quite a small group, so we can hopefully have some really good interaction. So yes, Emily and I spoke about this much earlier in the year, and we're planning the event, and it's like, okay, well, what is impacting charities now? What are we all having to deal with? And I think that the uncertainty that we've faced over the last 5 years in particular and moving forwards is just unprecedented. And as charity leaders, we're having to really think on our feet. We're having to be able to adapt, and we're having to plan without all of the information in a way that we perhaps haven't done before. I'm seeing some nods around the room, so that sounds like that's resonating for some of you. So what I'm going to talk about today, I've got about a 20-minute presentation on how we remain financially agile, because it's my strong opinion that actually a charity's ability to survive this uncertainty and change is our ability to adapt to the environment, adapt to the situation that we find ourselves in. And I've been through this process of rapid growth and contraction numerous times over the last 15 years or so. And they both bring them with them the same challenge. You'd think rapid growth and income coming in would be a good thing, but actually it can be really challenging and unsustainable for an organisation. So really sort of seen it from both sides. So we will be looking at contraction quite a lot, but also at how we deal with rapid growth. So very short intro to me. I have, as Emily said, I've worked in charity finance and charity leadership for over 15 years. I trained originally as an accountant, like I'm sure some of you did. I trained in practice, but always had a very soft spot for the charity clients. And then I was sent to do a 3-month secondment to help a charity out. One of our clients had some staffing issues, and I went over to do a 3-month secondment. And within 3 weeks, I was completely hooked on the voluntary sector. I just loved the way it worked. I loved the autonomy of it. I loved the slightly missed worldview that you're doing something good rather than just raising money, making money for somebody else. And yeah, within a month or so of starting that secondment, I had decided that this was me now, and I was into the charity sector for the long haul. While my background is strongly finance, and that is where my professional qualifications are, I love the variety of charity leadership, and I am extremely fortunate and have been for well over a decade to have quite a varied portfolio. So I cover within my current role and within previous roles, I've done everything, including HR, IT, data, direct project management, volunteering support, and lots of other stuff in between. So I really love being able to have that oversight of the whole organisation and seeing how different factors come in. But as I say, finance is my sort of go-to, and unfortunately, we do need to make sure we've got the strong background in finance to make sure that our charities can survive and thrive. Okay, I am going to attempt to share my screen. So hopefully you can see that slide deck now. Nothing too technical in here, but hopefully just some bullet points to talk through as we work through the presentation. So let's start with charities are like any other organisation. They very, very rarely stay the same size. It is part of evolution with so many factors coming in that we will continually grow or shrink. And actually, there is a very strong view that if, as a charity, we're not aiming to grow, we will shrink by default. We've got to always have those aspirations. And also, we're all here to help our beneficiaries. We've all got different beneficiary groups, but we are very much here to do as much as we possibly can. So, as well as constantly growing and shrinking, quite often, particularly in the charity sector, this can be quite rapid. It can almost feel like you wake up one morning and the goalposts have totally moved. You think that you're on a trajectory, you think you've got this plan, and suddenly something happens and you've got to be able to turn on a hairpin and you've got to be able to adapt to that. I think this has been particularly prevalent recently. Really, I guess I've seen this happen 10, 15 years ago, but it was very much internally driven. I think since COVID and the pandemic, we've really seen this being a global issue, I guess, for all organisations to have to deal with. And we know with the economic situation and political changes recently, things aren't getting any better. We haven't got that stability and that security yet. Let's be optimistic and hope that we are heading towards that, but it feels like there's still quite a way to go. So these challenging times, particularly over the last 24, 36 months, has meant that we've seen a lot of organisations have to shrink. Sadly, we've seen some of our biggest charities have to make significant redundancies. Quite often, some of the largest charities have had to shrink by half, which is massive. And even more sadly, we've seen a lot of organisations had to fold, which is devastating for them and for their beneficiaries. Interestingly, charity mergers are at an all-time high and have increased by 15% on previous levels over the last 12 months. So ensuring that we do remain financially sustainable is the only way we can ensure that our charities and our organisations exist into the future. But we also have to really make sure that we're not ego-driven as organisations. We are here to serve our beneficiaries. We need to stay true to those missions and values and not chase the money, because that is also a really slippery slope. Retaining organisation culture during rapid change is really hard, because you go into survival mode. You go into that firefighting where you are just dealing with whatever is the loudest problem, whoever's screaming loudest at that particular point. So I think in any charity leadership role, trying to hold the organisation together, to keep the values at the forefront, and to make sure that you kind of come out of this intact, because when you do get to the point of stability, whether that's as a rebuild or whether that's just a plateau, having maintained that culture and values and that way of working is going to be crucial in being able to move forwards. So what leads us to this rapid growth and contraction? Now, there are a multitude of things, and you will all have your own experiences of what that could look like in your own organisations. But I've categorised this into external and internal. So those external factors I've alluded to already. We're thinking about the economic climate. We're looking at government or regulatory changes. We're looking sometimes at media interest. It's amazing, the organisation I'm with at the moment, how a storyline on EastEnders can totally affect our demand. It is just bizarre. But if there is a particular media interest and that grows over time, that can really affect funding sources. It can affect trust and reputation over the whole voluntary sector, but specifically if it's for an issue for the area that you are working in. And then we've got those internal factors, those sort of curveballs that come from within the organisation. And I don't know if any of you are working in organisations where you are still led by your founder. I think that is a real factor to these quick turns. But also it can be where an organisation has overstretched itself, well-meaningly, wanting to do a particular project and that having overspend. Unfortunately, I'd love to know if any of you have sussed this, but finding long-term sustainable external funding is always a challenge. So we know that we are often, as organisations, working year to year in terms of income streams, and quite often they're not secured. So that loss, or in an ideal world, a massive influx of funding can both lead to having to make these rapid changes. And changes in cost base as well. So where something happens externally and one of your major costs majorly changes. And I'm sure a number of you will be feeling the pinch of the new national insurance charges. So that's a classic example of where a change in that cost base can really affect our ability to function and thrive. Okay, so dealing with uncertainties. This is a very long list. I will talk through each one and give a bit more context, but this is kind of my 101 of the things. And I'm afraid there are no silver bullets here. There is no magic answers. And some of these are really quite dull, if I'm honest, but they are all the building blocks to make sure that we are doing everything we possibly can to protect the financial sustainability and to ensure that our organisations can flex to meet the resources and do the very best we can for beneficiaries. So the first one is cash flow planning. Quite often, if you are an organisation that has significant cash reserves or very strong treasury management, this isn't seen as a major issue. But as soon as an organisation I'm in starts any kind of rapid growth or rapid contraction, cash flow planning goes to the top of the list. And I'm talking real detail. So in a recent period of contraction, my finance team it was the first job of the day. Every single day, you are looking at those cash balances. You are adapting what's going to happen in the next week, the next month. You are forward planning as much as you can over the next 6 months. And ultimately, it is very hard to say what's going to happen in terms of cash in 6 months' time. But if you've got a starting point, then at least you can see where those potential pinch points might be and head them off, whether that's through paying suppliers later by negotiation, whether that's by trying to phase income in a slightly different way, whether that's by looking at external funding. The next thing on my list is scenario planning. And again, it'll be interesting when we come to Q&A and a discussion later, but sometimes it's really hard to start this process because the possibilities are endless, whether that's positive or negative. And sometimes you can just not know where to start. It's like, well, there are too many potential scenarios to look at. So my way of working this is to start with 3. Always think about, okay, what are the likely, the worst, and the best case scenario in this situation? And I would always focus on the areas within those scenarios that are the high risk areas. Don't sweat the smaller stuff. The areas where you've got more control, the areas that are less likely to change, don't worry about them. Just have those as a constant through all your scenarios and focus within those scenarios on the higher level, the higher risk areas. Risk reviews. I don't know how the rest of you operate. I have quite a clear risk register that I try to keep quite concise. I say I fit it on 1 page, but it is really tiny font if you try to print it out. But trying to keep your risk register concise, but more importantly, using it with your staff team, with your leadership team, with your board to actually be aware of where are the risks, what are the things that might blindside us that we haven't thought about. What are the risks that we do know about? Is everybody aware of those risks and content with the mitigations that we're taking to try and reduce them? I've written contingency on here because that is what the textbooks would say, but I think the reality is we know within charities, within any kind of funding, whether that's statutory funding or trust and statutory funding, or even raising funds from the public, that building in contingency is rarely an option at any particular level. So whilst I put it on here, if you're in an organisation where you can build contingency in, then well done. But I know that it is a real challenge within the sector. Reserves. Can we just have a really quick show of hands as to how many of you are in organisations where you have the desired level of reserves available at today? Great. We've got a few, and we've got, a couple of maybes, definitely nots. Yeah, it's obvious, it's stating the obvious, but having those reserves at the outset is going to give you a much better chance to roll with the punches. It's going to give you much more ability to cope. And I think by having those reserves, it can also help negate the need for some of the other factors, because you've we call it our cushion. It is our cushion that we can bounce against should things change. The next one is really quite depressing, but I have always got a quite sad plan up my sleeve as to how I would cut more costs if I needed to. It's really horrible. And I sat when I was doing going concern for the auditors this year, and I listed out the 12 staff that I would remove should I had to cut those costs. And it's really grim to do it, but actually just having that in mind, being really practical about what would I do if I had to take off 10,000, 100,000, whatever is relative to your organisation. Having those open conversations really early demonstrates that you are going to be able to pivot and to make those changes should you need. And again, in better times, it is great to be able to sit down as a team and say, okay, we've got an extra £500,000 coming in. What are we going to do with it? Where can we best invest that for the organisation and for the best use for our beneficiaries? Clear policies and processes which are updated regularly. As soon as you need to start making changes to the organisation, if you have paid staff, if you have volunteers, that is where you are going to be asking them to make changes, and actually having clear processes in place as to how you will do that. Having clear HR processes in particular is going to be vital in protecting the organisation and enabling you to make those changes swiftly and effectively and fairly. Next one, again, I'm sure you're all completely aware of, and it's pretty obvious, but look at diversification of income. Most issues occur for organisations where they suddenly have a loss of funding, and they are totally reliant on that one source of funding. So be acutely aware of it. Look at where your income is coming from. Look at if there is any way you can diversify that. And it might not even be looking at a different income stream. It might just be not relying on a single funder or a handful of funders. If staffing, the majority of organisations I've worked in, staffing is our major cost. So thinking about your staffing, if there is any degree of doubt or uncertainty, but you are still taking staff on to meet organisational needs or to meet short-term contracts, look at flexible staffing, talk to HR specialists. How can you contract these people? So again, it's really clear and it's fair. Do you need to look at shorter term contracts? Do you need to build into terms the ability for staff to be able to move around, to be more flexible? When you're looking at your staff teams, are you looking at somebody to do a very specific role, or actually are you looking at a more utility-based employee who will happily step into the breach and, if they need to, take a split role, should needs of the organisation require it? And then outside of staff costs, think about short-term commitments. We know cost control is always really important, but sometimes taking a one-year contract at a premium is better for the organisation than taking a longer-term commitment at a lower per year rate. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, talk to suppliers early if you have got cash flow concerns, if you are feeling the pinch. In my experience, this is where you can play the charity card a little bit, and you will find that having those open conversations is hugely beneficial. Again, in times where I've had to go through rapid contraction and have had cash flow issues within organisations, being able to spread an annual cost over time, being able to delay payments has really been a lifesaver. Help and support. So I think what you really, as charity leaders, it's very easy to carry this all on our own shoulders, and it's very easy to feel quite isolated with this. So my mantra is always, stop worrying about it on your own, share this. It's not just down to you, and whether it's internal, or quite often I find it better to talk externally because you get a slightly different independent view on this. Professional support. And I know sometimes that's challenging because you don't want to incur more costs, but quite often an investment in professional support is vital. In particular, most organisations with charitable status may be able to access some pro bono support. So look at your local area, look at the pro bono providers and see what you can do. Think about your local networks, think about who you know, who may be able to give you that sort of critical friend view. Think early about finance options. So again, even if you are planning to get through a particular period, think about, okay, well, what would you do if that payment was delayed, if that income stream didn't come in as you'd anticipated? What's your go-to? You might think you don't need it, but actually, can you arrange overdraft? Can you reach out to Charity Bank and other finance providers just to assess whether that would be a possibility should the need arise? And again, hopefully you won't use these. This is all sort of pre-planning and thinking ahead as to worst case scenario. But if you hit that worst case scenario, quite often you don't have the time and you don't have the headspace and you're in that firefighting mode. Take legal advice wherever you're unsure. With boards of trustees, quite often boards are well constituted so that they have legal support. But again, don't be afraid to reach out for independent legal advice. I think sometimes there are specialist areas where it is well worth paying a small fee to make sure that we are acting both in the best interest of the organisation, but within laws and regs of how we're operating. Peer support. I find peer support, and have done throughout my career, really, really important. And that could be, I don't know, an ex-colleague that you meet down the pub every 6 months for a drink. It could be something more formal. I'm very fortunate in my locality. We've managed to set up a charity finance leaders network, and we meet 3 or 4 times a year and just chew the fat and work out what's going on in different organisations, where there are similarities in the challenges we're facing, where there's the opportunity to share information, to share contacts, to just ease things. I think trying to remove that competitive edge between us is really vital, particularly where it doesn't actually impact on charity performance. And if it can help us as individuals and therefore help our organisations and our beneficiaries, then I think working together and getting that peer support is hugely important. Again, a bit of a theme here, talk early to your donors and funders. If you are having problems, the majority of institutional donors and major donors in quite a lot of cases are reasonable. They would much rather understand that as an organisation you are struggling, that there are what has caused that struggle, what your plans are to recover from it. Quite often there is additional funding available for this, or they may be able to accelerate payment terms. Speaking to funders in the past, their worst case scenario is an organisation folds without them knowing when they could have stepped in to do something, but by the time they are brought into the loop, it is just too late. So it is tough, and you want to save face and you want to appear capable and professional as an organisation. But I would suggest that you really consider at what point and as early as possible you do speak to donors and funders. And working with other organisations, where can you save costs from a logistical basis, but also where, as I say, where can you share those ideas? It doesn't have to go as far as formal merger, but if you have an overlap in terms of mission and beneficiaries, there may well be ways that you can share resource to protect your beneficiaries. If you are cutting a service, who else is doing something that could step in? Is there some kind of signposting you can give to beneficiaries so they are not impacted by any cuts or changes that you are having to make to your organisation? And yeah, as you'll probably have picked up from the way I'm talking, I am very beneficiary driven, and probably that's why I love the charity sector so much. And I think even in times of real challenge, focusing on your beneficiaries rather than your organisation, remembering that we're not actually here to provide employment or volunteering opportunities or facilities. We are here to help those that we've been set up to help. And I think by focusing on beneficiaries when you're having these conversations and you're doing these plans, really helps staff to understand and ensures that as organisations we do stay true to our mission, that we don't put sticking plasters on that aren't in keeping with what we're here to do. And I think by providing that focus on beneficiaries, it can really help unite teams on other areas of the charity. We know that in times of challenge, and again, that could be growth or contraction, there is a higher risk of organisations splitting into silos and the individual interests of a part of an organisation or a specific team being in conflict with another. But by focusing on beneficiaries and being very clear on doing that, I think it helps prevent those silos and also prevents or helps to a degree to stop the us and them between operational staff and management. Communication is everything. And again, I think in that leadership, you kind of, you want to protect people sometimes, you want to hold things in, you want them to be able to focus on doing the frontline work. But actually the worst thing for an organisation's stakeholders is to feel that they've been kept in the dark. It can really lead to a lack of trust and major relationship issues moving forwards. So over communicate would be my starting point. And when you're dealing with sensitive issues around funding, around HR perhaps, around terminating projects or having to shut parts of an organisation, there are things that you can't talk about. There are points at which you are just not in a position to talk. And that's okay. But I think it's okay to invite that conversation, but be very clear that there are certain things you aren't going to be able to cover because of personal sensitivity or other reasons. But it doesn't stop you from making yourself available. I think the worst thing you can do is to shut yourself away. Try and give as much context as possible. And I think this really prevents that lack of trust. Explain why have we come to this point. Don't try to sugarcoat things. We're all human. And I think showing that side is sometimes really important. Again, look at peer support. Think about how you can get that peer support, whether that's internally or externally. Share as much information as possible and in as many formats as possible. So again, regular staff meetings, whether that's in person or online, but following that up with written comms, making sure that vital information is given in various formats, because we know, particularly with difficult information, sometimes it takes several goes for this information to sink in. And sometimes in the moment, particularly if it is affecting an individual, they will struggle to take that information on board straight away. So having the ability for them to go back, where I've made significant changes, I would always recommend using FAQs. So people have got a document in a clear place that they can go to and you can build on, because you can bet your life if one person's got that question, other people are thinking it as well. Update regularly, even if nothing has changed. And I know that sounds silly and possibly not best use of your time, but actually just checking in every other week to say, look, we're still on track. Look, unfortunately, we haven't had that information we were expecting, but we will keep you informed, can all really help, again, in preserving those relationships and building that trust. And as much as you possibly can, listen to staff and volunteers and other stakeholders. Try to create those opportunities for everybody to input. And you will have some off-the-wall suggestions that are just not viable, unfortunately. That's the way of the world, and that will be their particular viewpoint in the way that they're coming from. But again, if you can be clear as to what suggestions have been made and why they can't be implemented either at this particular point or at all, then again, it's this transparency, it's this showing your workings out, I guess, making sure that everybody understands the journey that the organisation is on and why you are at that particular point. So, final points just before we open up for discussion. Whatever your organisational size, the ability to change is imperative. So you could be a £10,000 organisation, you could be a £10 million organisation. All organisations need to be able to change, to grow, to evolve, to contract should need be. So don't feel in any way that you're too small to need to put these plans in place or too large, because it does affect globally. Sometimes you do have to hold your nerve, and you can only do that if you are part of a strong team. I've been incredibly fortunate throughout my careers in that I have worked in very strong leadership teams where it's not that we're all best friends. We don't always agree. There's quite a lot of healthy conflict, but you know that you've got each other's backs, and you unite as a team. try to create that psychologically safe space so that people can speak up, people can ask those stupid questions, because sometimes those stupid questions open up really interesting debates that can lead you to solutions. Be prepared as far as possible. It is very difficult, and that list of somewhat dull things that I went through earlier, I know that it is hard to prioritise that, but the more prepared you are, the better the ability to be able to ride these storms. Strong policies and procedures I've already mentioned, and I think particularly where you are having to make changes that affect individuals, by having those really strong policies and procedures, it just helps take some of the emotion out. It helps make it less subjective and to feel quite as personal. And the final point is, don't forget to celebrate your successes and reflect on your progress, because even when it's feeling tough, even when it feels like you're battling a storm and things aren't going your way, you can bet your life your charity is still doing amazing stuff and helping people. So don't lose sight of that. Even if you're doing less than you did 2 years ago, it's still more than you would be if you weren't here. So yes, and wishing you all the best. I know it is challenging times and it is tough, but everybody in this position is trying their very best and has good intentions. So yeah, hopefully there's something in that presentation that you can take away and make use of.
Wow, Claire, there was so much in there. That was really, really great. Thank you. I'm sure there's lots of takeaways for everybody, but whilst we've still got you, any questions that you have for Claire, I think, it's a great opportunity to pick her brains, really. So over to you for questions.
I have a question. Claire, I'm not expecting you to come up with a perfect answer.
Yeah.
I suppose I could put it to you and I could put it to the rest of the group. It was a lot of what you said has resonated, and a lot of your suggestions about doing this and doing that. I was thinking, okay, phew, doing that, or oh gosh, maybe I need to think about that. I think communication. I know this is a session on mainly being financially agile, but I guess communication has come into it, and it's come into very much a key part of what you were talking about. It's so challenging. We're going through a particularly difficult period at the moment, and the communication piece is always, for me personally, I can't quite land on when is the right time.
Yeah.
When is the right time to really start to show and tell people what is going on? And I've always kind of stuck to the idea that you don't want to open up a can of worms until you've got answers. You might not have all the answers, but you at least need to have as clear a picture as possible to open up the conversation, to then be ready to have the questions and the reactions. Yeah, I guess it was just your point was, people don't like to be kept in the dark. And that's exactly what we're experiencing. But I can't quite work out how myself and my SLT could have done things any more differently in terms of the current situation, because there's an element of trying to protect staff, but also trying to make sure we have a clear picture and that we have some answers to the problem. So I don't know if anyone or yourself have any other comments on that.
I think my starting point is you can never get this right, because the people you're dealing with are all different. And I think that's something I've found really challenging, is you will have one stakeholder who wants to know the nuts and bolts. They want to know every time something changes. You've got others that are totally freaked out and they just want to know if there's something major or if there's something that's going to affect them. So there is no perfect answer. In terms of timing, I think when I look back at where I've been in organisations with these challenges, I've never regretted giving information earlier, but I have regretted holding information back, would be my only reflection. I'm not sure if anybody else has got any views or experiences they can share.
I'm happy to say we went through a big organizational change process a couple of years ago when we had lost a lot of money and stopped having quite sort of good income, but we did survive. We came out the other side, and yeah, thinking about when to break the really bad news to people that there's going to be redundancies and all of that. I think people probably know more than you think. So when we actually got everyone, and we got everyone physically in a room with enough notice, so as many people as possible could really be there, so you could really engage with them, and they could express themselves at an emotional level to start with, whilst you're giving them kind of facts. And I suppose the other bit was that we couldn't prepare all the answers because people have lots of questions that you don't think they'll have. And so just like, you said, they need to not expect for you to have all the answers in that first meeting, and kind of you setting the expectations and saying, right, we'll take your questions and go away and come back. But having a series of communication points after kind of a big announcement was really helpful. And again, in different formats, like Claire said. So people could just write emails if that's what they needed and wanted to do, maybe quite long and ranty. And other people wanted to come sit and talk as they kind of absorbed news at different levels. And it was so interesting how many people heard one thing but not another, particularly when they're in the state of high stress. So you just had to repeat the basic things.
Yeah. And everybody reacts in very different ways. And I think where you are giving organisational change news, it's so important to give people space, whether that is just time to be able to reflect and respond, whether that's giving people platforms and forums. But it's kind of, again, people are individual, and there will be people that react immediately, react emotionally, or don't react at all. But it's trying to create the environment where actually all of that's okay.
Thank you.
Have we got any further questions for Claire?
I wanted to ask about reserves. I know sort of a healthy reserve depends on who you are and what you're going to do. So there's not an actual number or even, percentage which ideally reflects everything. We've got a reserve policy which reflects being able to cover the end of this year's projects and a little bit of money to sort of create redundancies if that was necessary. So that just seems like a safety first approach. But the problem I've got is that we've got 4 projects now, and they're in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
And a funder from one geographical area doesn't want to fund something which happens somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So actually, those reserves are getting harder to explain to that group of people. And if there was any advice on how we do that, and I obviously still remain agile.
Yeah. Are your funding streams, do they tend to be restricted funding streams, or is it unrestricted income?
It's mainly unrestricted income.
Yeah, which makes that segregation quite difficult, I can see.
Yeah.
Again, not knowing your organisation or your situation, reserves it is very much subjective. It is, I describe it as being a really difficult tightrope that you have to walk, because if you've got too much reserves, then you're not doing the best for your beneficiaries, and you can get called out on that. You're also likely to dissuade future funders because they will look at your reserves levels and you're not a priority. Equally, if you go too far the other way, then you are risking the sustainability and creating financial risks that you don't want to have. So I totally appreciate it's a very difficult area. Best practice at the moment tends to be looking at the level of reserves from a number of angles. So thinking about it very much from a risk-based situation. So not going back to the historical 3 months operating costs or whatever it is that your organisation may have used in the past, but actually looking at a whole range of different ways of calculating it. So you talked about redundancy and closure costs. You could look at the loss, the potential loss of income and the probability of that happening. You can look at those operating costs and actually looking at 3 or 4 different calculations and then working from that to triangulate, I guess, and come up with a best case. But I think the really vital thing with reserves is it changes. And again, there's no point setting a reserves level and then leaving it alone for a year and then coming back when the auditors ask you the question. As you adapt throughout the year, you need to be on top of that and you need to understand, are we ahead? And it's not just, this is where you're using it for decision making rather than just as a publication or something to send out to funders. And I think the other thing with reserves is when you are presenting reserves levels, look at restrictions, but also look at designated funds. I'm not sure if that's something you thought about, Vinny, but in terms of how you're presenting this, think about where you have got reserves levels. Do you need to designate those? So where you've got different funding streams, it can be a board decision to actually say, okay, we're going to have a designated reserve to cover this project in this part of the organisation, and we can have separate pots, if you like, which may help in your planning, but also in your communications.
Thank you.
Well, if that's all the questions, I think we can say a massive thank you to Claire there. And I really hope that you've all taken something away from today's session. I personally think it's absolutely fascinating to listen to these sessions. And I love the chat at the end where hopefully you're all, thinking along the same lines and you can take something away from the session. So thank you all for attending. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to invite you to our next virtual boardroom, which is on Monday, the 20th of May. Where we're joined by Kevin Parkinson, who's this Chief Exec of First Steps ED, and he'll be leading a session on the key to supporting talent across all ages. So we've got 5 generations now working side by side in some scenarios, and the session's going to explore how to build resilience and inclusive culture across your teams. And he'll give you some skills matrix toolkits to help you with those issues and scenarios. So hopefully you might find that beneficial. So I'll drop an email over to you all following the session with a link to our next one. And the slides will be available. If you want to drop me an email, I can send those across to you all as well.